They said you could see him, clear as daylight. A man standing in the middle of the street, his shadow long under the dim glow of the gas lamps. His face was pale, his coat dark, and in his hand, a knife dripping with the blood that would stain the earth for decades to come. Dozens of eyes saw him that night. Some swore he even nodded at them, as if daring them to remember. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. No footsteps leading away, no trace of where he had gone, as though the darkness itself had opened to swallow him whole. This is not folklore, not some ghost tale meant to frighten children. This is a case, recorded in official police reports, whispered in taverns, and buried in the archives for over a century. A murder committed in plain sight by a killer who vanished before anyone could take a second breath. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before the story pulls you in too deep, because once you step into this forgotten case, there's no turning back. The story begins in the year 1897 in a quiet district of City, where narrow cobblestone streets twisted like veins through the heart of a working-class neighborhood. People knew one another there. Every shopkeeper, every beggar, every child who ran laughing across the square. It was the kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. And yet, on that night, the most dangerous stranger of all walked among them unnoticed until it was too late. The victim, a respected merchant named Elias Crow, was walking home from his shop just after 9 in the evening. He carried with him the day's earnings tucked carefully in his coat pocket, but money was not what the killer sought. Witnesses later testified they heard Elias greet a man in passing, a man described as tall, with a gaunt face and a strange stillness in his movements. Moments later, the greeting turned into screams. Elias was struck down, his chest punctured again and again, until the life drained from him in the middle of the street. Here is the detail that chills every reader of the reports. Not a single witness saw the killer flee. In fact, many claimed they watched him step calmly into the crowd, his face unforgettable. Yet when police arrived within minutes, the man had already ceased to exist. He did not run. He did not hide. He simply disappeared. Some said he melted into the shadows. Others claimed he walked into a doorway that led to nowhere. And some, the ones who refused to speak publicly, whispered that the man wasn't a man at all. The district where Elias Crow fell was not an anonymous place. It was a world preserved in the rigid patterns of routine. Mothers drawing water from the communal pump, men gathering at taverns after long days of labor, and children darting between horse-drawn carts. It was a neighborhood where a face was either a neighbor's or a stranger's, and strangers were few. That is why the events of that night unsettled everyone so deeply. They knew the killer was not one of them. They were certain of it. And yet, he had moved with a confidence that suggested he belonged there, as though the streets themselves recognized him. The following morning, the body of Elias was carried to his home, his widow keening in a voice that echoed through the alleys. The community gathered, shaken not only by the loss of a man, but by the unexplainable circumstance. Rumors began before the ground was even broken for his grave. Some whispered that Elias had recognized the man, that his words of greeting were not casual but familiar. Others wondered if the killer had been watching him for weeks, learning his path, studying the rhythm of his life. What no one could explain was how so many witnesses had seen the face, and yet described it with subtle differences that made it impossible to pin down. One woman said he had hollow cheeks and sharp eyes. Another claimed he had a beard. A child remembered a scar across his forehead, but no one else could confirm it. It was as if every eye saw something slightly different, like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting pieces of a whole no one could reconstruct. Police sketches, drawn hastily from conflicting accounts, bore no resemblance to one another. The newspapers printed them side by side. A gallery of faces that looked like brothers, cousins, strangers. Anyone and no one at all. The public began to murmur of mass hysteria, as though an entire crowd had hallucinated the same killer in their terror. But the blood on Elias's coat and the knife wounds in his chest were real, far too real to be dismissed as imagination. And in the quiet of their homes after the city fell into uneasy sleep, neighbors admitted a truth that terrified them most. When they closed their eyes, they saw him again. His pale expression, his slow, deliberate steps, the way he seemed more shadow than flesh. Some swore they could still hear his boots on the cobblestones outside their doors, walking calmly, endlessly, as if he had never left at all. The night Elias Grow was murdered became one of the most dissected events in the town's history, not because of what happened, but because of how it unfolded before so many eyes. There were no alleys to shield the killer, no curtain of fog to disguise him, no silence to cover the sound of death. The murder happened in the open, on a cobblestone street illuminated by lamps, with more than a dozen people close enough to hear the fatal cries. By all logic, it should have been the most solvable crime of its age. Instead, it became the most confounding. Witnesses swore they saw the man approach Elias slowly, as though he were waiting to be noticed. He did not run, did not lunge, but walked with a deliberate stillness that unnerved those who saw him. Elias greeted him in a familiar tone, but before anyone could process the exchange, the stranger's hand flashed forward. The blade caught the light, and in a blur of movement, Elias collapsed. It should have ended there, with shouts, with men chasing after the assailant. But this is where every account fractures into impossibility. Some witnesses claimed they saw the killer retreat calmly down the street. Others insisted he turned a corner that led only to a brick wall. A child swore he stepped into the doorway of a shuttered bakery. But when the police forced it open minutes later, the building was empty and had been for months. A soldier, off duty and trained to observe details, argued the man never left at all, that he simply faded, growing less visible until the crowd could no longer agree on where he stood. The testimonies piled up into a cacophony of contradictions, none of them aligning, yet none of them deniable. Every person was certain of what they saw, but the details refused to overlap in any meaningful way. The result was a murderer who existed everywhere and nowhere at once. By the time police arrived, Elias lay lifeless, his body cooling on the cobblestones. His blood pooled in plain sight of neighbors who wept openly. Yet no one could point to the direction the killer had taken. It was as if he had stepped into another reality that lay just beside their own, visible for only a moment before closing shut. In the following days, townsfolk avoided the street altogether. Doors were locked earlier, shutters drawn tightly. For generations, families told their children not to linger on that stretch of cobblestone, because if you looked too long into the shadows, you might see him again, waiting, smiling faintly, daring you to remember a face you could never fully describe. The police response was swift. Within the hour, officers cordoned off the street, interviewing every witness they could find. Names were written down, sketches attempted, timelines reconstructed. By the following morning, the chief inspector himself declared it the clearest case the city had ever known. A killer seen by so many, a weapon bound to be discovered, a face etched in memory. It should have been an investigation destined for a swift conclusion. Yet every step forward led only into deeper confusion. The knife was never found. Officers scoured drains, gutters, refuse bins, even the nearby river, but nothing surfaced. Door-to-door searches yielded no suspect. No stranger was reported leaving the district that night. The station overflowed with witness testimony, but each account contradicted the next. Some swore the killer had a heavy limp, dragging his foot like a wounded animal. Others argued he strode smoothly, almost elegantly, his boots polished to a sheen. A few whispered that his clothing seemed to change as he walked. That one moment he wore a long coat, and the next it was short, the details blurring like smoke. The sketches pinned to the inspector's office wall looked like an assembly of ghosts, 20 faces that bore no resemblance to one another. Eyewitnesses argued openly, their voices rising, accusing each other of lying or misremembering. And yet, each spoke with conviction. None would admit doubt, even as their words tore the investigation apart. Newspapers fanned the flames. One headline shouted, "Killer walks among us unseen." Another asked, "Is the murderer real?" Columns debated whether mass hysteria had swept through the street, but such explanations offered no comfort to a grieving widow or to a city now terrified of its own shadows. The inspector ordered patrols on every corner, convinced the killer would strike again. But days passed, then weeks, with no sign, no whisper, no second crime. The man who had been seen by dozens seemed to have dissolved, not only into thin air, but out of existence altogether. Privately, some officers confessed that they feared chasing an illusion. "How do you capture a man?" one constable wrote in his diary. "When every hand points to him, but no two hands point the same way." The city began to choke on its silence. No one trusted the streets anymore. Shopkeepers shut their stalls earlier, children were called indoors, and neighbors turned suspicious eyes toward one another, as though the killer had not vanished at all, but instead lived behind a familiar door. As the weeks stretched into months with no arrest, the murder of Elias Crow transformed from a case file into a living legend, whispered in taverns and across dinner tables. The police, frustrated and humiliated, insisted the killer was a cunning man who had studied the streets, mapped his escape, and outwitted every witness. They argued he was likely a drifter who had boarded a late-night train and vanished into another city. But this explanation satisfied no one. The townspeople had seen him too clearly, too close, to believe he was a passing stranger. Soon, darker theories emerged, carried on hushed voices that lowered when children came near. Some believed the killer was not a man at all, but a revenant, a spirit of the dead, wearing human form long enough to commit a crime before sinking back into the soil. Others spoke of doppelgangers, figures from old folklore that could borrow the likeness of the living. A few even suggested that every witness had seen a different version of the killer because he had no true face, only the shifting reflection of whoever gazed upon him. The local church issued sermons warning against superstition. But even the priests faltered when pressed to explain why so many honest witnesses could not agree on a single description. Science offered little refuge. Doctors proposed theories of collective suggestion, claiming fear had blurred memory. Yet such answers felt hollow, for the one thing no witness disagreed on was the truth of the act itself. They had seen the knife. They had seen Elias fall. They had seen blood glisten under the lamps. Something tangible had stood before them, even if its identity dissolved like mist. Eerie struck deeper than the rest. A retired constable, unwilling to speak publicly, whispered to a colleague that he believed the killer still walked among them, but in a form unrecognizable. "What if he never left?" he asked. "What if he can wear any face he chooses?" His words spread like fire, twisting through the town's collective fear. Suddenly, every unfamiliar traveler was a suspect. Neighbors eyed one another with unease. And beneath it all lingered a gnawing dread. The thought that the murderer had not disappeared at all, but had simply chosen to watch, waiting for another night to act. Theories became a new kind of evidence, heavier than facts, shaping how people remembered the event. To this day, the legend does not separate truth from speculation. It has become one seamless fabric, woven of blood, fear, and unanswered questions. Months after the murder, when the town had begun to force silence upon itself, a final witness emerged. She was a seamstress named Margaret Hale, a woman who had remained quiet out of fear that her story would damn her sanity. But in the deep of winter, unable to sleep and plagued by the echo of boots outside her window, she confessed what she had seen. Margaret was standing no more than 10 paces away when Elias greeted the man. She saw the blade. She saw the blood. But what marked her most was the killer's gaze. She insisted he turned and looked directly at her as Elias fell, his eyes catching the lamplight. They were not, she said, the eyes of a man. They were hollow, unblinking, reflecting nothing, like polished stone. And as she gasped and stepped backward, she swore his face seemed to alter, not dramatically but subtly, like a ripple across water. The more she tried to focus, the less certain she became of what she was seeing. By the time she blinked, the man was gone. Not running, not hiding, simply gone. Her testimony was ridiculed. The inspector dismissed her as hysterical, her nerves overwhelmed by trauma. But others listened closely, for her words explained what none of the others could. If the killer had no fixed face, then every description could be both true and false. If his eyes were not human, then perhaps he had never been human to begin with. Margaret was tormented long after her confession. She told friends she heard his footsteps outside her window at night, deliberate and patient, as if reminding her of the look they had shared. Sometimes she claimed to see him on the street, not directly, but in passing, among a crowd. A man whose gait was familiar, whose stillness made her chest tighten with dread. By the time she pointed him out, he was gone. Always gone. Neighbors stopped visiting her. Children whispered that she was haunted, eventual. Margaret moved away, vanishing into obscurity, as though consumed by the same shadows that had stolen the killer. Her testimony remained a footnote in the police records, an anecdote filed away, too disturbing to be taken seriously. Yet, to this day, it is the only account that dares to explain why a murderer seen by so many left no trace at all. Years passed, and still no suspect was ever named. The file on Elias Crow's murder grew thin with neglect, its pages marked more by speculation than evidence. Eventually, the case was stamped unsolved and placed deep in the archives, where dust would weigh heavier than truth. The police moved on. The newspapers found new scandals to feed upon. But the town did not forget. It could not forget. For generations, the story was told in whispers, passed down like a family curse. Parents warned their children not to linger on Crow Street after dark. Shopkeepers crossed themselves when closing their shutters at night, muttering that the man with no face might be watching. Some claimed to see him still, a tall figure in a dark coat, moving too slowly, too deliberately, always just beyond the reach of clear sight. He would vanish the moment they dared to look twice. The more the story aged, the more it became something larger than a murder. It became a question about the limits of human perception, about how memory can fracture when confronted with something it cannot explain. Some insisted the killer was a clever man who had disguised himself and slipped away. Others held to the darker belief that the town had glimpsed something not meant for human eyes, a shadow that could take form long enough to strike, then dissolve back into whatever void it came from. And yet, despite all the theories, despite the fear and the folklore, one truth endures. A man was killed in plain sight, and the killer, seen by many, was never found. No one was ever tried. No one was ever punished. If the murderer was flesh and blood, he carried the weight of his crime to the grave, hidden behind an untraceable face. If he was not, then perhaps he still lingers, walking unnoticed through crowded streets, pausing now and then to meet the eyes of someone who will never forget the hollow chill that followed. The town pretends it has moved on. New generations walk those cobblestones without knowing the blood that once stained them. But beneath the surface, the silence remains. A silence that feels less like forgetting and more like fear. For how can you bury a story when the killer himself seemed unbound by the laws of life, time, or memory? And so the case remains open, not in the archives, but in the minds of all who hear it. The killer who vanished in plain sight may have never left at all. Every story leaves a scar. Drop yours in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Something is always listening.